Thank you, Annette. Good morning, everyone, from my side as well. It's a pleasure to be here. So yesterday, we heard that the space segment has become more dependent on software than ever before. Our economy depends heavily on satellite navigation applications, as well as Earth observation and communication services that are offered via satellites. Our daily life and economy are increasingly dependent on space infrastructure. And today, by using software, we can change the way we use and benefit from our space assets. The space segment gets more dynamic to adapt to the customer's needs, we need to make sure that it is safe and secure. On that note, let me introduce to you today's first panelists and great experts in international law and international space law to discuss further on the societal aspects of software-defined space. To illustrate several points we're making during this conference, they are joining us online. So in case you didn't already notice, we have with us on this stage Mr. Charles Mudd, Principal Attorney from Mudd Law, and Ms. Giulia Pavesi, a researcher in international law and international space law in Catholic University of Leuven. So without further ado, Charles, would you like to start off and tell us a little bit about your work and the topics you're currently focused on and passionate about?
Yes, thank you so much. I very much appreciate the introduction, and I'm excited to be a part of the panel. And I want to thank everyone there for having us involved. I wish I was there physically. My practice comes into two particular aspects. One is representing companies in the satellite or the space sector, but then also from the policy side, over the last few years, I've been heavily involved with astronomers and their efforts to mitigate the adverse effects of satellite, particularly SpaceX, the number of satellites crossing the field of view of particular observations here from Earth. And that has involved significantly not only an analysis of a lot of data, but also developing software and developing algorithms to try to not only predict when those satellites might cross field of view, but also to mitigate the effect of the satellites on images.
Great, thank you for that. Giulia, could you also share a little bit about your recent research and work, and can go from there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good morning to everyone. I apologize for not having been able to be there in person, but for the next time for sure. I'm a researcher, as you rightly mentioned, at KU Leuven at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. And my field of research is mostly space security. And particularly what is the legal framework in international law and in international space law on what I've defined as both space operations. Non-kinetic counter space carried out in the space context. I also work as an expert for multiple EU projects on space traffic management, European space policy, and more broadly, space governance.
Great. One of your research also touches on critical infrastructure and critical infrastructure theory. Could you open that definition, that topic, and that concept for us and for the public?
Yeah,
Giulia,
sure.
Thank you.
We don't have a shared universal definition of critical infrastructures, but if we look at national, regional, or academic approaches, we can say that the common defining feature of critical infrastructure is the increasing interdependence among infrastructure systems. So each infrastructure reciprocally affects the status of the connected infrastructure. And then later on, if you want, I can discuss the type of dependencies that exist. The interdependency can display in many shapes, in many links. This could be the cyber link, the geographical, the policy link as well, the procedural, and the societal. When then we go to analyze how critical infrastructure should be dealt with, usually we adopt a system of system, which means that we have to identify and map all the interdependencies of the system, all its complexity, in order to then design an efficient and an appropriate critical infrastructure protection strategy. Also for critical infrastructure protection, we don't have a shared definition or a shared understanding of who should be the responsible actor to take care of it. This shifted mostly in the past decades from a national prerogative to a supranational one sometimes, if we also think sometimes to some segment of the European Union. Again, critical infrastructure protect focuses on the interdependency of the system, which means that I have to identify the risk transmission and the cascading disruptive effects in the critical infrastructure to then design an efficient strategy that goes to ensure resilience, meaning the capacity of the system to recover after the risk has materialized.
How does that critical infrastructure affect our society and what it means to our society, as it has a lot to do with security? Charles, would you like to follow up on that? Oh, you're on mute, I think. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Of course, we couldn't proceed without a technical snafu, right? We have to have one. So I would say that, as you mentioned earlier, cybersecurity and in a particular aspect, I think that many people fail to realize the critical infrastructure and the interrelatedness of cybersecurity through all basic critical infrastructures, whether that be particularly in the context of space today, satellites, telecommunications, weather, any kind of Earth observation aspects, but also communication between any number of other sectors and aspects of the critical infrastructure that we have. I think that, so when we think about that, the effect on society is kind of, it's a quiet effect. I don't think that we really realize how vulnerable to a certain extent we happen to be to risks of cybersecurity, both here on ground and then also in space, and the effects that certain threats to that critical infrastructure could have. I mean, I was reading an article, it was something completely outside the context of perhaps what we're talking about here, but it was talking about finding exoplanets and suns, for example, and it was referencing this one particular sun that has such bursts of flares, solar flares, that it would knock out, that if it was our sun, that it would knock out all of the infrastructure for a long period of time. Now, we do have solar flares here in, obviously with Earth here, not as severe. But again, these are the kind of things that we're really not prepared for on a large scale with respect to infrastructure. So I don't know if I've answered your question or not, but what I've tried to demonstrate or show is that I think that it's not as obvious and noticed generally by policymakers, legislators, how significantly vulnerable the infrastructures happen to be at the point of time, and when they go down, the effects that it would have on society.
What do we do when they go down? What do we do when somebody, for example, tries or decides to attack, for example, Sentinel satellites, and are we ready for it, or who is ready for it? Charles, perhaps you want to?
Yeah, I think that, that's an interesting question. And I think that diverse national governments are trying to address that. NASA definitely is focusing on cybersecurity, but I can tell you from the commercial perspective, I don't think that a lot of companies are taking seriously the threats, the cybersecurity threats in space. I think it's something that, it's one of those things that everybody thinks that, it's not going to happen to me, or why target me, and so forth. In terms of what should happen, we need to have a really robust system where it's not just commercial operators being inclusive and not talking with one another. They need to talk with each other. They need to talk with national governments. The governments need to speak with each other, so that if there is a threat, then we can address it immediately, that there can be redundancies, shared redundancies, so that we can cover any kind of outages. But the key, both terrestrially here in the world on Earth and in space, is to have a plan of attack. Have robust systems protecting the computers, the technology, and then have a plan of attack when there is infiltration, when there is an attack, on how to respond. You can't develop that the moment that you realize that somebody's attacked your system.
That's a great answer. Julia, would you like to add?
May just...
Yeah, sure.
Indeed, yeah. I fully agree with what Charles just said. With regards then to the Sentinels issue, maybe a further layer of complexity is the distribution of responsibility across the Union. So here, a further layer of complexity to ensure the resilience then of what could be defined as critical infrastructure, including, for instance, some segments of Galileo, is to also define the chain of governance when responding to that kind of threat. Something has already been done, actually, in that regard, or is undergoing with the new space regulation that the EU adopted last year, because it's defined very well the roles, at least in general terms, and now they are narrowing down the specific responsibility of each actor in relation to the EU flagship programs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that really quickly, that I think that having those responsibilities laid out is important. And I think we need to encourage industry and governments to be forthcoming when there are cyber attacks. 10 years ago, any company would be very reticent to publicly identify that there had been a data breach or that there had been an intrusion, because they'd be fearful that that would have repercussions on the market, their market, their customer base, and the public perception. But nowadays, I guess if there's lemonade to be made out of lemons, one advantage of the proliferation of those kind of attacks, though, is that unfortunately it's commonplace. And so for a company to publicly identify that there has been a data breach or a cyber attack, it's not with the same kind of negative effect that might have been before. But when we talk about the space context, it's so important to have that communication and the responsibility, because under the Outer Space Treaty, the launching parties are responsible for any harm to objects. Now, that responsibility is absolute where there's harm here on Earth, and then it's depends on fault base with respect to harm or damage in space. it behooves all parties to be very interested in trying to shore up the defenses, cyber defenses, so that rogue players don't obtain control of satellites and do something, to try to cause harm. A lot of it might just be data access that they're wanting rather than a truly rogue entity or individual trying to take control of a satellite and throw it into another's path. But those are possibilities that we need to be talking about.
Great. Giulia, did you want to add something or no?
Yes, I would like to add something also on that those are more strategies that should be implemented by states than at national or international level. And it really relates to an holistic approach to cyber risk management, meaning that not only and especially in the space context, where we still have somehow outdated space segments in orbit, for the new generation of satellites to be launched, we should really promote awareness of the emerging threats and investment in cybersecurity. Emerging threats, especially because if we look at counter space capabilities, kinetic ASATs now are mostly used for power projection, meaning that in the future, the tendency is to go through less disruptive counter space, including cyber and electronic warfare. Here, therefore, the commercial actors, but also the national actors, through the implementation of their outer space treaty obligations, for instance, when they have to license the space mission, they should really focus on cybersecurity by design among their requirements. We should also increase, and this is also something for which national states have to create the appropriate fora for exchanging information and for discussion. We also need to increase knowledge sharing mechanism across all the civilian space sector, which means that we need to narrow down and some best practices coming both from the industry and from the governments also on cybersecurity, as well as to identify links between national cybersecurity agencies and national space security agencies. And then more at the international level, of course, it would be advisable to increase cooperation among countries, once again, in sharing best practices. For this, we actually have a lot of regional, supranational, and international frameworks that we can use. Both in the civilian aspects of space activities and in the military aspects of space activities.
Great. I have a challenging question. I think you are all both on the same page that we should tackle this issue from the legal and policy perspective, but there's also an opportunity to just keep increasing the number of satellites we send up there and pack up our critical infrastructure every possible way. Charles, I know that you like to do stargazing as a hobby. What is your reaction to this? And could you respond?
Fear and abhorrence, I think. But I think that increasing the number of satellites isn't the answer. And I think what's scary in part is I was on a panel with a representative of the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and they were talking about the authorization of satellites, and nobody, I mean, that is let's say, the clearinghouse, right, where all of the countries are supposed to submit the satellites and the numbers and so forth. But nobody talks about the fact that for each orbital altitude, there is a finite number of satellites that can be in that space safely traveling at 14,000 kilometers an hour. But nobody identifies what that number is. And so we have all of these countries, including the United States, licensing satellites. Now, many of them are not launched yet. SpaceX has a license in the US, for example, for, let's say, 40,000 satellites. I think they're only up to about 3,400 that have been launched. But nonetheless, when you think about the number of countries, the number of companies within each country that are wanting to launch satellites, I think we need to get to a point where we do know what that finite number is and think about it, not only in terms of just the satellites themselves to avoid collision and conjunctions, but also in terms of the International Space Station, space exploration, wanting to get through the number of satellites. There was an image, I just saw a YouTube video. I think it was NASA I'm not going to remember the name of the company right now that has the orbital data, but they had a visualization of a NASA spacecraft having to navigate through the variety of debris and satellites that we have orbiting Earth. So no, I don't think that increasing the number of satellites is the answer. And you mentioned astronomy and observing. I am a fan of that. And one of the projects that I'm working on right now is looking at the number of images that are affected by the satellites and just focusing on Starlink satellites and one particular telescope, the DCAM, Dark Energy Camera in Chile. And from 2019, the end of 2019, it was about 0.3, just my rough numbers that haven't been validated and so forth. But just to give you an idea, it was 0.3, 0.5% of the images, the observations, had satellites cross their path. A year later, the end of 2020, where we're at about 1,000 Starlink satellites, the numbers in order of magnitude larger to where we have 3 to 5% of the images with streaks in them. And if that continues to grow with the number of satellites, we're soon going to have to rely on the James Webb Space Telescope, and space observations, because we won't be able to get clear pictures from here on Earth. So the number of satellites, the answer is not to increase them, even though that could perhaps solve some redundancy problems and have robustness in the critical infrastructure in space. That's not the reason to go carte blanche.
Right. Giulia, do you also have reactions, thoughts on the same question?
Yes, I fully agree that we shouldn't, that the solution is not more satellites, especially if we consider that so far we don't have space coordination systems in outer space. And I refer to space coordination, space traffic coordination, space traffic management, because that is even more complex. So far, also to the licensing, with regards to the process, this is a national prerogative, of course. And so far, we could see it with the filing of 100 of thousands of satellites. Then it's to be questioned whether they will be launched. But we see that there is a rush to try to occupy at least the slots in outer space. And this tendency is actually very worrying if we consider that we don't have internationally agreed space traffic management rules. So let's say that the solution is more satellites. Of course, more satellites increase redundancy, that's for sure. But we first need to agree on some rules of the road, as it happened with the air traffic later in the past.
Yes, we have agreement on that side. I would like to turn to the public now. Are there any questions that you've been thinking through this panel? Do you have any challenging questions to our panelists or thoughts you would like to add or share?
If there's not a question yet, there was one comment that I wanted to add, and I think that the EU might be ahead of the United States in this regard, based on what Giulia was saying in terms of allocating the responsibility for cybersecurity in space operations. Because if you look at the United States, it's quite diverse in its jurisdiction over space activities. So we have the FAA with launches, the FCC with satellite operations, NOAA with Earth observation. And there is no agency in the United States that is claiming responsibility for enforcing and making sure that commercial companies, using Giulia's term, cybersecurity by design, to have the robustness in the design of their spacecraft. And while the FCC says, yes, it's a good recommendation that companies have cybersecurity protocols, they don't necessarily believe that they are the agency to impose that. The problem is then there's no agency right now that is going to impose that. And so it really then comes to commercial operators to engage in best practices. And while that's important, I'm not a fan of relying on industry to solve all of the problems by themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the call is, I guess the conclusion, the call is to make sure that all governments do require satellite operators, satellite manufacturers to have that design aspect.
We have a question from the audience. How do you foresee the future of complex supply chains in space industry, in which we can see cooperation between companies from different regions? Should there be precise legal framework regarding multinational, multi-regional cooperation for critical infrastructure? It feels like that question might be for you, Giulia, perhaps?
Yes. So for supply chain, actually, in the space industry, this is a question that is quite critical both for aspects of space and for military aspects of space. Recently, for instance, there was a debate also within NATO whether, of course at the academic level, whether we should focus more now on the supply chain within NATO, of course, when it relates to space, and whether it is there that somehow states should agree on some cybersecurity standards. I don't think could have an international approach to this issue, because also supply chains are, in the end, mostly managed at the national level. What I can see, perhaps, is still coordination, meaning that states should really agree on best practices. And this could be done actually quite easily on a bilateral way. This is something that we had already done for other fields of space activities. If we think, for instance, to sharing of data, space situational awareness data between states, those happen have happened both on a bilateral way, so through bilateral agreements between governments, mostly the US governments with other customer or contributing governments, or within regional frameworks, so to say. In the case of the EU, we started with a support framework and then we evolved to a partnership. And there we created some procedures and some governance mechanism. And in the case of the US, we also integrated in our product commercial data, which means that somehow we had to identify and then to rate somehow the supply chain. So I think that right now we cannot go immediately through an international approach, but for sure what we could do is to go through a multi-step approach. We start from what we have at national, regional, bilateral level, and then we try to export the lesson through a lesson learned approach, what we have learned at the international level.
Charles, would you like to add any thoughts, or we would have
Yeah, just really briefly, I do think that given the growth that is going to happen in commercial space operations, on-orbit servicing, and all of the potential that we can see, I think that there will need to be a loosening of export control regulations across governments, definitely. And really quickly, if I could jump in, the video that I referred to is a NASA video. And if you Google NASA spacecraft flies through satellite swarm, you'll be able to find the visualization that I referred to earlier. But I definitely think that we need a loosening of export control laws.
Agree.
That is great. We have one question from the audience. Last question.
I was wondering, since we have law experts, and that's not very often in my profession here, is it who's liable? So if there's a cyber attack and then and then this does harm, you mentioned it's the launching nation that's responsible, but who's liable commercially?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that, there are two ways to answer the question. One is looking under the Outer Space Treaty and the Liability Convention. It sets up how to address disputes between the governments, but that doesn't necessarily preclude civil litigation by a particular company against other parties. And I think that to a certain extent, under the treaties, it's the launching state still. And I think that needs to be updated, particularly with the growth of the commercial satellite industry. It's a completely different situation than when those treaties were implemented. But putting that aside, I think it comes down to negligence and due diligence. And if you have a commercial operator, for example, that does not implement cybersecurity by design, as Giulia mentioned, I think that, and they let themselves thereby have an attack, and that attack causes some harm, whether it's in space or on Earth. Let's say that the satellite falls out of orbit and does not burn up. I think that company could face liability. I think it's going to come down to a negligence standard. And therefore, the more that governments and industry can establish what that minimum standard will be, that standard of care, the better off that we're all going to be. I think that, again, I'll reiterate that cybersecurity by design, or as I like to say, compliance by design, think about those issues when you're designing the spacecraft. That's the time to set up that robustness to avoid potential liability. Giulia?
Yes, I cannot agree more. Actually, it was a very exhaustive answer. Maybe the other thing when we think about the liability convention is that we should also try to identify what do we mean with fault. And this is something where also a standard of care at the national level then could help clarifying what we intend with that, and to update somehow the treaties. which I fully agree. Right now, they are not the appropriate instrument to be able to tackle the next disputes.
Great, thank you. Our time is unfortunately up, but thank you for the panelists. I think we all understood that there is a long way to go. We need clearer governance in the space segment and more sharing of best practices and an agreement on how to go forward between states and internationally. Thank you, everyone, and I'll give it back to Annette. Thank you.